I love listening to the family stories and recording them. Isn't that what our heritage is about? I realize that I am very fortunate in that much of my family history has been recorded. How do I tell my children and my grandchildren our family histories? What parts to use? Let's see. I find it fascinating to see that on both sides of my family, people left Europe because of religious persecution. On my paternal side, a Huguenot flees from France to England. Then he brings his family to Acadia, arriving at Port Royal in 1657. A few years later, his two sons, Pierre and Charles, marry French Roman Catholic women and convert to that religion. All the Melancons in the world are related to these two brothers. Isn't that ironic? In 1984, an archaeological site began on the north shore of the Annapolis River, a few miles from the town of Annapolis Royal. This was the home of our ancestors Charles Melancon and Marie Degas, and their descendants from 1664 until 1755, when the British deported the Acadians from this land. The site was officially named the Melancon Settlement National Historic Site of Canada at the Melancon Family Reunion in 2004. Margaret C. Melancon has written a book called The Melancon Story, Acadian Family, Acadian Times. It is a great read, well researched, and I have an autographed copy of it. When the British forced the Acadians from their land, Charles' son Ambrose and his second wife Marguerite and some of their children escaped and went to Quebec. Some children remained hidden in Acadia, and some were held as prisoners there until the end of the 7 Years' War. They all lost their land. So many stories. What to tell? Maybe my grandchildren would like to know about the small diary Cécile Murat, who was my great-great-great-grandmother, kept for over 30 years. She married Jean-Baptiste Melancon and raised 14 children. She taught her children to read and write. She tells of the terrible fire that swept the French shore in September of 1820. It burned all but 2 houses in Church Point, and many family records kept in the church were lost in the fire. An article in the newspaper tells of the death of Louis A. Melancon, my great-grandfather, Nova Scotia's spruce gum king. There's a photograph of Louis and another of Church Point in the 1930s showing my great-grandfather's house. Theodora M. Carroll wrote a history of our New England ancestors, my maternal ancestors. I have one of the original copies of her manuscript. The Hallecks were part of a group of 13 Puritan families fleeing from the Stuart tyranny. They arrived in New Haven, Connecticut in 1640. 2 generations later, a Halleck son marries a Quaker preacher, and our part of the family became Quakers. One of the sons settled in Milton on the Hudson in 1760 and established his family there. The book is fascinating reading. There's so much here. Descriptions of family members, homes, and gatherings. Letters written from one family member to another using the Friends language. Letters from sons written to their mother during the Civil War. My great-grandfather Edward Nicholas Halleck and my grandfather Charles Samuel Halleck came from New York State as far west as Three Valley Gap in 1908 looking for lumber. It was in Calgary on that trip that my grandparents were married. 19 years later, the 2 sides of my family, the Melancons, who were Roman Catholics, and the Hallecks, former Quakers, come together when my father and my mother meet at a community dance in Ebola, BC. But that's another story. One my father, who was also Louis A. Melanson, had the foresight to record in his autobiography. Do these glimpses of stories from generations that knew the value of recording and collecting them tempt you to do the same? What stories of your family will you tell?